"Which chamber for her grace, sir?" asked the housekeeper, and the Duke of Wrenlow, 4 hours married and still in his wedding coat, said, "The north box room." Mrs. Tilney's hand went to her keys. She had been at Wrenlow Abbey 31 years, and had never once questioned an order, and she questioned this one. "The box room, your grace, over the stable arch." "You know the one." "I know it, sir. It has one window and no fireplace worth the name, and the ceiling comes down to the floor on the north side. The maids use it for hanging out the winter blankets. We had a governess in it in your grandfather's time, and she gave notice inside the month." "Then it is aired," said Lucian, "and there is nothing wrong with it that a bed will not cure. Put her there." There was a long pause in the great hall of Wrenlow Abbey, and the fire cracked, and 40 feet away, on the far side of a room the size of a chapel, the woman he had married that morning stood with her traveling cloak still buttoned, and her one small trunk at her feet, looking up at his ancestors on the walls with her hands folded, entirely still, and gave no sign at all of having heard. She had heard. He knew she had heard. The hall at Wrenlow carried a whisper the length of it, which was why his family had used it for 400 years to say things they wished remembered. "Very good, your grace," said Mrs. Tilney, and her voice, for the first time in 31 years, was cold to him. He had not meant to be a man who did such a thing. It is worth saying, because he said it to himself a great deal in the months that followed, and it never once helped. 6 weeks earlier, he had sat in the estate room at Wrenlow with a bond on the table in front of him in his father's handwriting, and had understood in the space of 2 minutes that his life was no longer his. £41,000, that was the figure. His elder brother Rollo had lost the greater part of it at cards over 5 years in London, and his father, who could deny Rollo nothing, alive or dead, and who had covered it all in silence, and then died of the effort, had gone in his last winter to a timber merchant named Silas Marlowe, of Bristol and Gloucester and the Baltic trade, a man with no birth, no manners, and money like water. And Marlowe had lent it on one condition, set out in the bond in 7 lines of plain commercial English: that the Duke's surviving son and heir, Lucian, should marry Marlowe's daughter Hester within the 12-month, or the whole sum should fall due at once with interest. There had been a great deal of legal opinion. There always is. The end of it was that the bond was good, the estate was entailed and could not be sold, the tenants could not be squeezed, and the choice before the Duke of Wrenlow was to marry a merchant's daughter he had never seen, or to break up the abbey, sell the Gloucestershire farms, turn off 90 servants, and become the Duke who ruined the house of Wrenlow to spare his own pride. So he had married her. He had ridden to Bristol and sat in a hot parlor with damask curtains and too many candles while Silas Marlowe talked about tonnage for 50 minutes, and then had his daughter brought in like a bale of goods for inspection. She was small and brown-haired and not beautiful, and she had a steady way of looking at a person that Lucian, then and afterwards, found unbearable. He had asked her, the only question he asked her that day, whether she understood the terms. "Perfectly, your grace," she had said. "And you consent to them?" "I am here," said Hester Marlowe. Which was, he thought later, an entirely different answer, and he had been too angry to notice. They were married in Bristol on a wet Tuesday, and traveled 90 miles in 2 days, and did not exchange 40 words. He had spent those 2 days with his jaw set, listing his grievances like a man counting money, that he had been sold, that a tradesman had bought a duchess's coronet for his daughter as another man buys a horse, that every family in England would know it by Michaelmas, that this small, silent, brown-haired woman in the corner of his carriage was the visible price of his father's weakness and his brother's ruin, and would be sitting at the foot of his table for the next 50 years to remind him of it. So he put her over the stable arch. He was, at that time, 39 years old, and had been considered by everybody who knew him to be a hard man of complete integrity. He discovered on his wedding night that a man may keep his integrity to the letter, and behave like the worst blackguard in the kingdom, and that the two things sit together very comfortably indeed if he is careful never to look at them at the same time. He did not look at them for 11 weeks. He was a great deal at Gloucester in that time, and at the London house, and when he was at the Abbey he dined at 8, and she dined at 8, and they spoke of the weather and the roads with impeccable courtesy across 9 feet of mahogany. And afterwards he went to the library, and she went up the north stair. And he did not know how she spent her evenings, and told himself he did not care. It was Mrs. Tilney who broke it, in the way of housekeepers, without saying a word. He had come in from the frost on a black November evening, up the back stair to save crossing the hall wet, and at the turn of the passage over the stable arch he stopped, because there was light coming out under a door where there ought to have been nothing but blankets and cold. Not candlelight, lamplight, a steady, generous, golden bar of it lying across the boards in warmth on his face, and the smell of beeswax and dried apple and lavender, and a fiddle. Somebody in there was playing a fiddle, badly and with tremendous enthusiasm, and somebody was singing, and somebody else was laughing so hard she had stopped singing, and a young voice was saying, "Again, Your Grace, do it again, only slower." And Hester Marlowe's voice said, "Certainly not, Tom Pargeter, you are murdering it, and if the Duke hears that noise he will have us both hanged from the stable clock." Lucian stood in the dark passage of his own house in his wet coat for a long minute, and then he knocked. The fiddle stopped as if it had been shot. The door opened 4 inches, and then all the way, and warm light fell out over him, and he looked into the north box room over the stable arch for the first time since he was a boy of 9, hiding from a tutor in it. It had been whitewashed, all of it, the sloping ceiling that came down to the floor and the ugly boxed-in chimney breast and the deep splay of the single window, done in 2 coats of lime by somebody standing on a chair. The bare boards had a rag rug on them, plaited out of strips he recognized, with a small shock, as the lining of a traveling cloak. A shelf of scoured deal ran under the window with 11 jars on it, quinces, medlars, pickled walnuts, dried chamomile, each labeled in a small square hand, and above them hung bunches of herbs on strings. A geranium was flowering out of season in a cracked jug. There was a lamp with a mended chimney, clean to a brilliance, and a brass warming pan and a work-basket, and a shelf of 9 books. And on the wall, in a frame made of 2 laths and a strip of gilt paper, a piece of embroidery worked with the words, "Be it ever so small." There was a fire in the miserable little grate, burning very economically, and the room was the warmest room he had been in that winter. There were also 4 other people in it. The boot boy, Tom Pargeter, aged 12, with a fiddle he had plainly been given. Nan the 3rd housemaid, sitting on the floor. Old Bicknell the under gardener in the one chair, with his bad leg up on a stool and a mug in his hand. And Mrs. Tilney the housekeeper, 31 years at Wrenlow Abbey, standing at the shelf with the lamp glass in her hands and a cloth, polishing it in her own mistress's bedchamber at 9 o'clock at night, entirely at home. Every one of them shot to their feet. The mug went over. Nan curtsied so hard she nearly went into the fire. "Your Grace," said Hester. Lucian, Duke of Wrenlow, looked at the whitewash and the labeled jars and the plaited rug made out of her own cloak lining, and could not, for a moment, produce speech. "You have a fire," he said, eventually. It was the stupidest sentence of his life. "I have half a fire, sir. It is a very poor grate and it wants the back reset, so we burn small coal and turves, which are cheap, and Bicknell has taught me to bank it so that it holds till morning." She was not apologizing. She was explaining, kindly, as to a slow visitor. "Will you sit? There is only the one chair and Mr. Bicknell has it, but Tom will fetch the stool from the linen room in a moment." "I will not sit." He heard how it sounded and tried again. "That is, I am wet through, Mrs. Tilney." "Your Grace." "You are polishing a lamp glass." "I am, Your Grace," said the housekeeper, and looked him in the eye and went on doing it. "Why?" "Because Her Grace mended it with a wet paper collar when it cracked in September rather than ask for a new one," said Mrs. Tilney. "And I cannot get the crack out, sir, but I can get everything else out, and I have found that I like to." Somewhere below in the stable yard, a horse shifted and a chain rang. "How long," said Lucian, "has this room been like this?" "Since about the 3rd week, sir," said Hester. "The whitewash was Bicknell's doing. There was a quantity left over from the potting shed, and it would only have gone hard in the pail. The rug took longer." "And the company?" She smiled at him then for the first time in 11 weeks. It was a rueful, apologetic smile, and it went through the Duke of Wrenlow like a nail. "That is my fault entirely," said Hester Marlowe, "and you may forbid it if you choose, and I shall not argue. But it is the only warm room on this side of the house, Your Grace, and Bicknell's knee is very bad in the frost, and the 4th-floor passage where the girls sleep has ice on the inside of the glass, and I found I could not sit in the one warm room by myself and know it." He went down the back stairs without saying good night, which was unpardonable, and stood in the estate room in his wet coat with his hand on the cold marble of the chimney-piece for a considerable time. He did not sleep that night in the state bedchamber, which was 22 feet by 30, hung in crimson damask, with a bed his great-grandfather had bought in Paris and 2 windows facing the park, and in which the fire had been lit at 6 by a housemaid who had come up from a passage with ice on the inside of the glass. He began, being the man he was, with the accounts. "Mrs. Tilney, the household coal." "Your Grace." "There is 140 tons ordered in September, and it is November, and Fothergill tells me we are into the 2nd cellar a month early. Where has it gone?" The housekeeper looked at the ceiling. "Mrs. Tilney." "Her Grace has an allowance of coal for her own grate, sir, being 3 scuttles a week, and she has never once burned 3 scuttles, because from the 2nd week she has had 2 of them carried up to the 4th-floor passage for the maid's room, and 1 to Bicknell's cottage in the frost, and she has burned turves and small coal and what Tom Pargeter picks off the yard. That is where the coal has gone, Your Grace. Nowhere. It is the tallow that has gone. She sits up mending till 1 and 2 in the morning." "Mending what?" "Everything, sir," said Mrs. Tilney. "Sheets, livery. She turned 6 shirts for the stable men in October and would not be told it was not her place. She has hemmed 30 yards of linen for the poor basket that used to be bought in ready-made at 8d. the yard, and told Fothergill to put the difference to the coal, which he has, and which I was going to tell you at quarter-day, and am glad to tell you now." Lucian put down his pen. "And the money for the physician at Bicknell's," he said, "in October. Fothergill has it as an item from the house." "Fothergill has it wrong, sir." "Then who paid Dr. Ganthorne?" Mrs. Tilney's mouth worked. 31 years of service is 31 years, and she had been ordered, and he saw her weigh it, and he saw her decide. "Her Grace pawned her mother's ring at Boulay's in Gloucester for £4.10, said the housekeeper, "on the market Thursday, when Bicknell's wife was took bad with the pleurisy, and there was no getting a physician out to a cottage for a promise. She gave it to me to carry. It is in Bolize still, and the ticket is behind the tea caddy in the still room, and if your grace turns me off for saying so, I shall go, but I shall say it first. There was a silence in the estate room at Wrenlow Abbey. She has an allowance, said Lucian. 200 a year for her own use, paid quarterly. It was in the settlement, I drew it myself. She has never touched it, sir, said Mrs. Tilney. Not a penny. She told Fothergill in the first week that she did not choose to spend money she had not earned in a house where she was not wanted, and asked him what a housekeeper's wage was at Wrenlow, and when he told her, she said she would live on that and let the rest lie, and please would he not tell you. Lucian went out of the room. He got as far as the corridor and stopped with his hand flat against the paneling. £200 a year lying untouched at 3%, and a mother's ring in a pawnbroker's window in Gloucester for £4.10. And the man who had done that was the man in the mirror at the end of the corridor, with the Wrenlow jaw and the 11 quarterings and the perfect integrity. The letter came to him 3 days later, and he had no business reading it and read it. It arrived in the bag with the estate post because Silas Marlowe wrote to his daughter care of the Duke's steward, as he wrote to everybody, in a large commercial hand on paper stamped with his own timber mark. Lucian slid it with the rest before he saw the direction, and had read 4 lines before he understood, and read to the end, because by then it was too late. "Daughter," it began, "your last is received. I do not know what you expect me to do about it, and I will tell you plain I will do nothing. You have a coronet on your linen and a park with deer in it and 100 servants, and you write to me about a small room. When I was your age, I slept over a saw pit and thought myself well off. You were 3 months in the sulks over this business, and gave me a deal of trouble, and I bore with you longer than most fathers would. And if you had held out any longer, I should have done as I said, and put you with your Aunt Deborah at Halifax to keep her shop, and you may believe that or not as you like, but you know me. Now you are a duchess, and it has cost me £41,000, which is my own money that I made and no man gave me, and I will hear no more complaining. Make yourself agreeable to him. That is all your business now. Write to your mother on the 10th as she looks for it." Lucian read it 3 times. 3 months in the sulks. She had refused. She had refused for 3 months, and been threatened with a shop in Halifax, and had come at last to a hot parlour in Bristol to be looked over by a duke who asked her whether she understood the terms. "I am here," she had said. He sat down in the estate room with his father's bond in one drawer, and Silas Marlowe's letter in his hand, and understood at last that there had been 2 people sold in that transaction, and that only one of them had spent 11 weeks making it everybody else's fault. He had it sealed again and sent up by a footman, and never told her, and never afterwards forgave himself the reading of it. Lady Sibylla Orme came to dine on the Thursday, with her mother, because the neighbourhood had waited 11 weeks for a sight of the merchant's daughter, and would wait no longer. Lucian had known Sibylla Orme since they were children. There had been an understanding of sorts, never spoken, of the kind that consists entirely of other people's expectations, and she had a wit that the county called delightful. She was in excellent form. She admired the Duchess's gown, which was 2 years old, and asked where it was made, and said Bristol. How very interesting, and asked whether it was true that Mr. Marlowe had begun in the way of business with a single barge, and said that she thought it a wonderful thing, a truly wonderful thing, to have made so much out of so little, and that she was sure Wrenlow had never been in better hands. "Do you find the Abbey very large after your father's house, Duchess?" "I find it very cold, ma'am," said Hester, "which I understand is the same thing." "And which room have they given you?" "I ask because I know every room in this house. I have known it since I was 6. Lucian set his glass down. He was aware of Mrs. Tilney behind him at the sideboard going absolutely still, and of the footman not breathing, and of the fact that the truth was known in every kitchen within 9 miles, and would be at the Ormes' breakfast table by 10 o'clock tomorrow, whatever was said now. "She has the north room over the stable arch," he said. "I put her there. It was done in the first hour, on my order, out of temper, because I had been made to marry against my will, and I wished her to know it. It is the smallest and coldest room in the house, and it has no proper chimney, and my wife has whitewashed it herself, and given her coal away to my maids, and pawned her mother's ring to fetch a physician to my gardener's wife, and has never in 11 weeks said one word of complaint to me or to anybody else. I mention it, Lady Sibylla, because you were going to hear it tomorrow with the details wrong, and I had rather the county had it from me, and had it complete." Nobody said anything at all for some seconds. The soup went round. "Well," said Lady Sibylla Orme at last, with a bright, unsteady laugh, "how very frank." "It is a new habit," said Lucian. "I find it very disagreeable, and I intend to persevere." Her mother, who was deaf and vague, and by far the more intelligent of the two, said comfortably that a small room was a great blessing in winter, and that she had spent her happiest years in one, and asked the Duchess how she managed her quinces. He sent Fothergill to Gloucester on the Friday, with instructions to redeem a ring from Beaulies and to say nothing. And Fothergill came back, and reported that the ring had already been redeemed a fortnight since by a Mrs. Tilney, in cash, out of her own wages, and that Mr. Beaulies had been most obliging. "Then reimburse Mrs. Tilney," said Lucian, "and add £15 a year to her wage, and tell her it is not for the ring." He did not give the ring to Hester. He put it in Mrs. Tilney's hand, and asked her to put it back among her mistress's things without a word, as though it had never been out of the house, because he had begun dimly to understand that there are gifts which are only another way of reminding a person what they owe. And then, on the 2nd of December, the Duke of Wrenlow gave the order that made his household believe for a full day that he had lost his reason. "Mrs. Tilney, the old schoolroom on the North Passage." "Sir?" "It adjoins the box room over the arch, does it not? There is a wall between them and a boarded-up door." "There is, sir. It has been a lumber room these 20 years. "Have it cleared," said Lucian. "Have it whitewashed 2 coats, the same as hers, and get Bicknell to do it if his knee will bear it, and pay him for it as a job of work. Have the grate reset, and both grates and hers first. Take up my camp bed from the gun room and the small deal washstand and 1 chair, and my books from the window recess in the library, and put them in there. I shall sleep in it from tonight." Mrs. Tilney stared at him. "Your Grace means to sleep in the schoolroom?" "I do." "With respect, sir, there is the state bedchamber, and the blue chamber, and the king's room, and 11 others." "There are 29 bedchambers at Wrenlow Abbey," said Lucian, "and I have discovered that the only inhabited one is over the stable arch, and I have no intention of asking my wife to leave it, because it is hers. She made it out of limewash and rags and her own 2 hands, and I have no right to hand it to her twice. So I shall take the room next door. It is the nearest I may lawfully come to being invited in." There was a pause. "Very good, your Grace," said Mrs. Tilney, and went out and shut the door, and stood in the passage for a moment with her hand over her mouth. He slept the first night on a camp bed in a whitewashed lumber room with his feet cold, and the smell of lime in the air, and the noise of the stable clock immediately overhead, and it was the best night's sleep he had had since his brother died. He was woken at about 2 by 3 small knocks on the wall behind his head. He lay still, then he turned over and knocked 3 times back. A pause, then, muffled through 11 inches of Tudor brick, quite clearly, "Are you very uncomfortable?" "Extremely," said the Duke of Wrenlow to the wall. "Good," said the wall. December at Wrenlow was the strangest and happiest month of his life to that date, and it was conducted almost entirely through a wall. They kept perfect propriety by day. He dined at 8 and she dined at 8, and they spoke now of considerably more than the roads, of the reset grates, and the 4th-floor passage, where he had ordered a stove and a chimney cut at a cost of £90 that his agent thought lunacy, of whether the poor basket ought to go out on Fridays or Mondays, of Tom Pargeter, who could not read and could play a fiddle by ear, and who was to be taught his letters by the Duchess of Wrenlow 3 evenings a week, at which Lucian raised no objection whatever, and afterwards found himself standing outside the door, listening to a boy of 12 laboring through the alphabet. But at night, when the house was still and the stable clock had struck 11, 3 knocks would come through 11 inches of brick, and the Duke of Wrenlow would put down his book. She was better read than he was and pretended not to be. She had opinions about drainage. She had grown up in counting-houses and knew more about interest and freight and the price of Baltic deal than his own agent, and when he told her one night that he was considering the purchase of 100 acres at Ludwell, she asked him 4 questions through the wall and then said, kindly, that he was being cheated, and told him by how much, and was right. "Duchess, Your Grace, why did you never say any of this at dinner?" A pause. "Because a woman who is not wanted in a house learns very fast to be useful in ways that cannot be resented," said the wall. "Mending can't be resented. Coal can't. Advice can. I have been saving it." He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling. "You may stop saving it," he said. The frost broke on the 8th of January and came back on the 9th with a wind out of the northeast and snow with it. And on the 10th there were 9 cases of fever in the 6 cottages at Ludwell Ford, and Dr. Ganthorne was at Cheltenham and not to be got. Lucian rode to Cheltenham himself. It was 14 miles, and it took him 5 hours, and he got Ganthorne out of a warm house at 8 in the evening, and rode back beside his gig through a drift on the Painswick Road holding a lantern. And by the time they had the physician into the first cottage at Ludwell, it was 2 in the morning, and the Duke of Wrenlow had been wet to the skin for 11 hours. He remembered very little of the next 9 days. He remembered being got up the back stair. He remembered the smell of lime wash and chamomile, and the cold of a spoon, and somebody saying his name, not his title, his name, in a voice that had stopped being calm, which frightened him more than the fever did. He remembered a hand on his forehead at some hour when the stable clock struck 4, and he remembered, distinctly, being furious about something, and being told, with great firmness, that he might be furious in the morning. He remembered the door. He was told afterwards that on the 2nd night, when it was very bad, and the physician had said what physicians say, the Duchess of Wrenlow had sent for the carpenter, and had the boarded-up door between the schoolroom and the box-room opened, and that Hobbs had taken out the deal boarding and the old lath, and found the door still hung and sound behind it, and that she had opened it, and carried her chair and her lamp, and her work-basket through, and sat in it for 6 nights with the door standing wide. "The whole house knows, Your Grace," said Mrs. Tilney, on the 10th morning, plumping his pillow with unnecessary violence and her eyes red. "The whole house has known since the Tuesday, and there is not one soul in it that thinks the worse of her, and if there were, I would have their character off them by dinner. She sat with the door open and Nan in the room, and she never lay down once, and she cut your hair off at the temples on the Thursday because it was wet through with the fever and would not dry, and she cried about that afterwards in the still room where she thought nobody was. And that is the only time she has cried in this house, sir, in 4 months, and I hope you may live to be sorry for it." "Mrs. Tilney," said Lucian, "you are the most insolent woman in England." "Yes, your grace," said Mrs. Tilney, and blew her nose. He got up on the 11th day, weak as a cat, and shaved by his own valet, and dressed at last in a coat that hung on him, and walked 6 feet through an unboarded doorway into the north box room over the stable arch, and sat down in the one chair, because Bicknell was not using it. Hester was at the window shelf with a jar of chamomile in her hands. She had lost weight. There were shadows under her eyes like thumbprints. "You are not to be up," she said. "I am aware." "Ganthorne said a fortnight." "Ganthorne says a fortnight about a sprained thumb." He put his hands on the arms of the chair. "Duchess, I have something to say, and I have been arranging it in my head for 6 days, and if you interrupt me, I shall lose the thread and be obliged to begin again, which will exhaust us both." She set the jar down and turned round and folded her hands, and looked at him with that steady look he had once found unbearable. "On the 2nd of December," said Lucian, "I sent to my solicitors in London for a deed. It came on the 4th of January, and it is in the estate room now, signed by me and wanting only your name. It settles upon you, absolutely and for your own life, the Ludwell farms and £800 a year out of the Gloucester rents, free of my control and of your father's, and secures to you the right to live where you choose at Bath, at Lyme, at your aunt's shop in Halifax if it amuses you, and to be visited by nobody you do not wish to see, including me." Hester Marlowe did not move at all. "The bond is my father's business and mine," he said, "not yours. It is being paid off at 4,000 a year, and will be clear in 9 years, and no part of that touches you. And I have written to your father, in terms which I shall not repeat, to tell him that his daughter is not a receipt for £140,000, and that if he ever again writes to her in a house of mine in the way he wrote to her in November, I will send his letter back to him unopened by a servant, and he may make of that what he likes in the way of business." He paused. "I read that letter. I opened it with the estate post, and I had read 4 lines before I saw the direction, and then I read the rest, and it was dishonorable, and I have not been able to tell you until now. And I am telling you now because you are entitled to know the worst thing about me from me, and not from anybody else." "3 months in the sulks," said Hester. "You refused him for 3 months." "I refused him 7 times, she said. "I'm a tradesman's daughter, your grace. I did not want a coronet. I wanted a house with 4 rooms in it and a man who came home in the evening. And then he threatened Halifax, and I looked at it honestly, and I thought, a duke is a stranger, but Aunt Deborah's shop is 40 years of counter and no windows, and if I must be sold, I will at least be sold where there are books." She lifted her chin. "So I said I was there. And I made up my mind on the road that I would not whine, and that whatever room they gave me I would make it worth having, because it was the only thing left that was mine to decide." "You made it the only room in the house," said Lucian. "It has a very good window." He got up out of the chair, and had to hold the back of it for a moment, and did not sit down again. "Then hear the rest," he said, "because the deed is not the point of it. The point of it is that when you have signed it you will be a free woman with 800 a year and no obligation on earth to me. And then, when it can cost you nothing to say no, I intend to ask you to stay. Not in that room. I am not going to insult you by offering you the state bedchamber either, as though a larger box were an apology. A man who has behaved as I have does not get to buy his way out with square footage." His voice was not steady. "I am going to ask you to keep this room, since you made it, and to let me keep the one next door, which I have got very fond of, and to let that door stand open, and to let me tell you at 11 o'clock at night about the drainage at Ludwell for the next 40 years. Because I have been married to you for 4 months, and I have slept 11 inches from you for 6 weeks, and in that time I have gone from a man who thought he had been robbed to a man who cannot go up the back stair without looking for a bar of light under a door." Hester Marlowe put her hand over her mouth. "You put me over the stable arch," she said. "I did. There is no defense, and I have stopped looking for one. I have thought about it every single night." "So have I," said Lucian. "No," she said, "you have not, because you have thought about it with shame, and I have thought about it with—" She stopped, and started again, and her voice went. "Your Grace, on the 3rd night in this house I sat on the floor because there was no chair in my cloak with a tallow end, and I said to myself, 'Very well, nobody is coming.' And then Bicknell brought a pail of limewash that was going to go hard anyway, and Nan came up because it was warm, and Mrs. Tilney came up because Nan did. And then in November a man knocked on my door at 9 at night in a wet coat and said, 'You have a fire,' as if it were a wonder of the world." She was crying now, and furious about it. "And then he had a wall taken down. Nobody has ever taken a wall down for me." "It was a door," said Lucian. "The wall is load-bearing." Hester Marlowe laughed until she had to sit on the floor, and the Duke of Wrenlow got down beside her with considerable difficulty, being 11 days out of a fever and 40 years old that spring, and took both her hands and did not let go of them. She signed the deed on the 15th of January in the estate room, with Fothergill and Mrs. Tilney as witnesses. Then she went upstairs and put on her mother's ring, which had come back among her things in November by a route she had never inquired into, and came down and told her husband that she had decided to stay on terms. And the terms were that the boarded door was never to be boarded again, that Tom Pargeter was to have 3 evenings and a proper fiddle master, that the 4th-floor stove was to be lit from the 1st of October every year whether the Duke thought it cold or not, and that nobody ever was to be put over the stable arch again, except by their own choice. He agreed to all of it in writing, because she was a tradesman's daughter, and said that a thing agreed at a dinner table was nothing at all. They kept the 2 rooms. It was talked of for years, the Duke and Duchess of Wrenlow, with 29 bedchambers and a state apartment hung in crimson damask, living in a whitewashed box over a stable arch and the old schoolroom next it. And Lucian, who had once cared more for the county's opinion than for anything else in the world, found that he had entirely stopped hearing it. Silas Marlowe came in the spring, prepared to be magnificent, and was shown the north box room and the mendied lamp glass, and the rug plaited out of a cloak lining, and stood in the doorway of it for a long time without saying anything, and then went out into the passage and blew his nose like a trumpet, and was afterwards, for 11 years until his death, the most useful and least mentioned benefactor the Ludwell cottages ever had. And on winter nights at Wrenlow Abbey, long after the stable clock struck 11, the Duke of Wrenlow would knock 3 times on a wall he no longer needed to knock on, purely for the pleasure of hearing his wife knock back.